Okay, Mom, tell us the story.
I was born on my grandparents' farm near McTaggart, Saskatchewan, Canada, on December 19, 1922, and was named Amelia Magdalena Bayerle. My mother, Wilhelmina Vogel Bayerle, was called Minnie. She was the daughter of Margaret Schultz and Michael Vogel. I have no memory of my mother since she died when I was 3 months old. However, I've been told that she was a happy, good-natured girl. She had long, curly, light brown hair and loved to run in the wind and let the wind blow her hair. My grandparents, Margaret, called Grady, and Mike Vogel, raised me with their family. Their youngest daughter, Kathy, was only 2.5 years older than I. Although I knew at an early age that my real mother was dead, still I called my grandparents Mother and Dad, and their children, who were still living at home, Mike, Max, John, Ann, and Kathy, I called my brothers and sisters. Their daughters, Amelia and Matilda, who were already married, I called aunts, confusing to others, but normal to me. I have to say I felt loved and secure. No mother could have been better than my grandmother, and Ann and Kathy were especially dear to me. However, Mother was very sad sometimes. I remember one occasion when I was sitting on a bench beside her as she was kneading bread. I was asking her questions about my real mother, and the tears were dripping into the bread dough as I prattled. I suppose she was so unhappy because my mother and Dad had died, so I stopped talking about it. On other occasions, when I questioned her about dates, she cried, so I simply learned not to talk about it. Philip Bayerle had come to the Vogel farm as a hired man and fell in love with and married Minnie. I don't believe he ever lived permanently with the Vogels after my mother died. He worked as a hired man for other people and came to visit me almost every Sunday. I called him my Philip Daddy. Apparently, he must have come often. I remember him sitting on the steps leading upstairs from the kitchen. I would stand on the landing where the steps made a right-angle turn and combed his hair. I also remember him taking hold of both of my hands with one of his and lifting me up as I would jump up and fasten one of my legs under one of each of his arms and hang upside down. I thought that was great fun. I was later told that one of his hands was crippled, but I don't remember that. My Philip Daddy died when I was 5. I was told he was heartbroken when my mother died and never took care of himself and died of pleurisy brought on by exposure. I don't really know very much about that. I still have a very vivid memory of his funeral in the Roman Catholic Church in McTaggart. The top half of the casket was open, and I was taken up to look at him. I began to cry hysterically because I thought they had cut off his legs. I was frantic because people didn't understand what I was crying about. This was a vivid memory for a long time. I'm not opposed to taking children to funerals, but I do believe everything should be clearly explained to them. I had a happy childhood. I've been told that, being the baby, I was spoiled, and no doubt I was. Father Vogel was very stern, and I was somewhat afraid of him. Some of my bad habits at the table were swinging my legs and singing or whistling, and I got many a thump on my head with his knuckles for those 2 sins. A rule at the table was that everyone had to clean their plate, I hated fat meat, just couldn't get it down. And Mother would slip the fat that I couldn't eat off of my plate onto her plate. Much later, I found out that she hated fat meat too, but she ate it so I wouldn't get into trouble. That's a mother's love. I started school at Muckamore, a little one-room country school, and enjoyed learning from the beginning. Although German was usually spoken at home, my sisters Kathy and Ann taught me English, and in fact taught me to read, and I don't recall that I ever had any difficulty at school. I was apparently a sickly, scrawny child. My grandmother's sister, Aunt Gertie, and Uncle Charlie took me to live with them for a couple of years when I was 8 or 9 years old. They gave me lots of TLC, fed me good food, and cod liver oil. Ooh. And my general health improved. I enjoyed my time with them immensely and felt close to them and to their daughter Anna ever after. When Muckamore School was closed, we went to school in McTaggart, 3 miles away. This was a 2-building school, grades 1 through 8, probably 25 to 30 pupils, all taught by one teacher. And in the other building, grades 9 through 11, taught by Mr. McCruden, a fixture in the community for 30 years or so. I got good grades in school and always was an avid reader. I was teased sometimes because if I didn't have anything else to read, I read the dictionaries. We drove to school by horse and buggy, and after Kathy quit school, I rode horseback. Yes, there was a stable to keep the horses in, and even hay to feed them, and a well with a trough to water them. I remember when my usual pony Lady foaled, I had to ride Nigger, a very tall, black, hard-mouthed beast, who I could not control at all. I was small and slight for my age. The boys boosted me into the saddle at home, and Nigger was all right going to school, but coming home was a different story. He would prance and dance while the kids at school had to hold him and boost me into the saddle. Then, when they let him go, he would get the bit between his teeth and gallop like the wind with me hanging on for dear life, and not stop until he sailed through the barn door and into his stall. The boys would stand in the barnyard laughing. They thought it was very funny. I did not. As I grew up, I learned to do many of the chores in the house and farmyard. Kathy and I even stooped one summer. We thought it was very hard, and it probably was for 2 young girls. Stooking was setting up the sheaves of grain TP fashion so that the grain would finish drying out, ready to be threshed. I also spent one summer on horseback herding cattle in the marsh, a sort of community pasture where the sloughs hadn't yet dried up. This was during one of the dry years when there was not sufficient grass or water in our home pasture. The cattle had to be herded so they wouldn't stray into the neighbors' crops. I grew up, as you know, through the hungry 30s. Even the farmers had to go on relief, and this was a great embarrassment to my proud grandfather. But the entire community was in the same condition. The crops were wiped out by drought, hail, plague of grasshoppers, always something each successive year. The dust storms were terrible. Dust would pool on the insides of tightly closed windows. Food had to be closely covered, or it'd be covered in dust. I don't remember ever going hungry, but I do remember going to school with no shoes. When at the age of 13, I got my first bought dress for Anne's wedding, was ordered out of the Sears catalog, I was in heaven. I still remember what it looked like. Most of my clothes were homemade until I went to work and was able to buy my own. One vivid memory I have was standing in the farmyard watching a plague of grasshoppers come flying in like a cloud that settled on the field across the road and ate their way across the field, and then they flew away, and there was not a shred of grain left in the field. Can you think what a disappointment that must have been to my grandparents? And the farmers and all the farmers in the community were in the same condition. After my brother John was married in 1937, Kathy and I moved with Mother into a little house in McTaggart. Those were happy years for Mother, I think. I think it was because she wasn't under the thumb of any male member of the family. Since it wasn't offered in the school in McTaggart, I had to go into Weyburn for grade 12. I worked for my board for the Jeffrey family, and it wasn't easy. For example, on Monday mornings, I had to get up at 5 o'clock in order to get the laundry out on a clothesline before leaving for school. I did all the ironing, the cleaning, and much of the cooking, as well as looking after 2 small children. Housework had to be done at night after the children had been put to bed. Nevertheless, I graduated in June of 1940 at the age of 17. I wanted badly to go to college, but there was no money. Finally, my Aunt Gertie and Uncle Charlie paid my tuition at business college in Weyburn, and I again worked for my board, but this time it was with an older couple whose children were grown, so it was much easier. My first job was with Bowman Brothers in Weyburn, an automotive parts store, as secretary and bookkeeper. The manager was Jim Menzies, who introduced me to the Bible and the doctrines of a little church of which he was pastor, which is now called the Community of Christ. I had been brought up Catholic and had not really thought much about doctrine up until that time, although as a child I did attend catechism for 2 weeks every summer with a couple of nuns who came in. But religion didn't have really much significance for me. Of course, I was baptized as a baby. Anyway, after I was in contact with Jim Menzies, I began to read the Bible, and I studied a lot. And finally I felt that this new faith was right for me. And so I decided to be baptized. I was baptized by immersion in the Souris River in Weyburn on November 19, 1942, at the age of 19. A hole had to be chopped in the ice for me to be baptized. But I didn't feel cold. It didn't affect me. Many members of my family were very angry with me, and it caused a rift in the family, which was not mended for many years. Mother was not happy with my decision, but she was not so unforgiving as many of the others were. Now, however, I believe that all of my family have accepted and love me as I am. After a broken engagement in Weyburn, I decided to move to British Columbia. I stayed over one winter in Armstrong with my cousin Min Oberly, who had married Mike Harrison-Chuck. In the spring of 1940, I moved to New Westminster and found a job with Burns & Company, a meat packing plant in Vancouver, where I was sales secretary. I learned how to deal with upwards of 20 salesmen. I lived in Burnaby and traveled by tram to Vancouver to work and New Westminster to church. It was at church that I met Merlin Miller. We fell in love and were married on July 19, 1947. Our honeymoon was spent at Reunion, a family camp at Silver Lake, Washington. Merlin's mother lived with us in an apartment in Burnaby. I continued working until Crystal was born on December 4th, 1949, in Vancouver General Hospital. In 1952, Merlin was working as an electronics expert for a company which transferred him to Calgary. So we moved there. I went to work for an attorney. Merlin had for several years been taking a course in electronics and television and had to go to Los Angeles, California to finish it. So we moved to Los Angeles. After he got his degree there, we moved to Seattle, Washington, where Merlin's uncle Myron Beckman, his mother's brother, and family were living. Merlin got a job as a TV serviceman. Gail was born in Northgate Hospital in Seattle on November 24, 1953. In a few months, we were able to rent a house, and Grandma Miller, who had stayed in New Westminster when we moved to Calgary, came down to live with us. Later, we purchased a home in Lake City, a suburb of Seattle. We had attended church at Woodland Park in Seattle, but then began to meet with a small group in Bothell, a suburb of Seattle. And we eventually started a mission there with Merlin as pastor. Evan was born on December 11, 1959, also in Northgate Hospital. Merlin began to feel a call to work with the people in Mexico. He eventually decided we should move down to Rio Grande Valley in Texas. We sold our home, and with as many of our possessions as we could cram into a large U-Haul truck, we made the trek down to the valley in September of 1960. Merlin got a job as an engineer in the TV station in Harlingen, and we rented a house there. Merlin started driving down to Matamoros, Mexico to help with a small church group there. He started a mission at Colonia 16 on the outskirts of Matamoros. I went down with him as much as I can, and as soon as my Spanish was good enough, I began to teach the children. We often took Evan down with them. The older girls, the two girls, didn't really enjoy going down to Matamoros with us very much, and so we usually left them at home. But Evan came with us and was a great hit with the Mexican children, who would love to watch out for him while we were holding classes in the homes. I have vivid memories of him walking down the street with the Mexican children, and they would be patting his head because they loved his curly blonde hair. We didn't really need to worry about him because the children in the neighborhood would take good care of him. Eventually, a cinder block church was built, and we had a thriving congregation in Colonia 16. Those were good, productive years. I was happy to be working with the people in Mexico. The Mexican people could not have been more loving and caring, and I have many fond memories, especially of the children that we worked with. Grandma Miller, who had stayed in New Westminster when we moved to Calgary, came down to live with us in 1963. So she was there to stay with the children, and I was able to spend more time at Colonia 16. Looking back, I realize that the girls felt somewhat neglected because of our working with the people in Mexico, and I'm sorry for that. But I don't know what I could have done differently at the time. Eventually, after 5 years of working at the TV station and spending all his spare time in Mexico, Merlin was put under church appointment, and we moved to Brownsville across the river from Matamoros, and then it was much easier to go over there. But 1966 was a bad year. It came out that Merlin was involved with a woman in Matamoros, and he decided to give up church work. He got a job with a TV station in Laredo, Texas, and the family moved there during the Christmas school break in 1966. Merlin moved Grandma Miller into a little house a couple of blocks down the street from us. Do you remember that, Evan? You used to go down there after school for her to take care of you while I was working.
I remember very clearly.
Evan, being in school, I went to work for Dr. Malakoff, an obstetrician, as a secretary. It was there that my co-workers started calling me Amy, and I liked it because I felt I wanted to be a new person, a better person, and I began calling myself Amy too. Later, however, I found out that Merlin had moved the woman with whom he was involved to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, across the river from Laredo, Texas. That was a bitter disappointment, but I was still determined to try to save my marriage. In 1968, Merlin decided to take a job as a television engineer in Saudi Arabia. And he worked over there. He came home in January 1969 and took a job in San Antonio, and we moved to San Antonio, and Grandma Miller was moved into a small apartment a few blocks away. I went to work for Dr. Phil Day. Crystal had graduated from high school, and after working in Corpus Christi for a while, she married Tom Butcher and moved to Fort Worth, where Teresa was born. But Crystal found out that Tom was a kleptomaniac, had stolen from his employer and was fired, and eventually they were divorced. In November, Merlin went back to Saudi Arabia, and he worked in Saudi Arabia for the next 7 or 8 years, coming home only once a year for 2 or 3 weeks for vacation. He came home for Gail's wedding on November 27, 1971, and the day after the wedding, he informed me that he wanted a divorce. So we went down and filed, and the divorce was final on February 9, 1972. Merlin at the time had returned to Saudi Arabia for Gail's wedding. Crystal and Teresa had returned from England, where she had moved with her second husband, Wayne Weatherly, who was in the Coast Guard. Crystal was pregnant, and Jenny was born on March 14, 1972. Crystal and I decided to take a trip to Canada. So we bought a little 15-foot camping trailer, and Crystal, Teresa, Jenny, Evan, and I set out, pulling the trailer behind the Pontiac Le Mans. We had a great trip, driving to Yellowstone National Park, to Seattle, then up to Vancouver and across Canada, eventually to Weyburn, then down through Independence, Missouri. We visited many relatives and friends all along the way. We traveled from the 1st of June to the end of August. It was a good way to recover from the sadness of the divorce. On our return, Crystal and the girls left to join Wayne in Spain, and I bought a mobile home in which Evan and I settled down. I went to work for Dr. Maxwell Parker. I had taken 2 years in night school at San Antonio College and had earned a degree as a certified medical assistant. So I began teaching night school courses in medical assisting in 1974 and continued doing so for 8 years. I was also very active in the American Association of Medical Assistants, serving as president 1 year and chairperson of the state convention another year. Of course, I also continued being active in church, especially teaching children. On October 16, 1976, I married Cal Stevens, who I had been dating for about a year. He invested all his savings in a citrus packing plant in Edinburgh in the Valley, going into partnership with his stepson. Unfortunately, neither of them knew anything about the business, and they lost everything they had put into it. Also, the fumes from the chemicals used in processing the citrus caused Cal's existing emphysema to become much worse. He refused to quit smoking. His health steadily deteriorated, and he had many hospital admissions until finally, even at home, he was constantly on oxygen and completely bedridden. He passed away on December 12, 1983. Meanwhile, Christina, Gail's daughter, was born on March 16, 1974. Crystal, with the 2 girls, left Wayne, who was physically and mentally abusive, and they were divorced. Gail's Christina had severe kidney surgery, and I went to Albuquerque, where she and Jimmy were then stationed, to help out. I had been keeping watch over Grandma Miller as her health declined, checking on her daily. One evening she fell into a steamer trunk which she had been emptying of all her handwork, and I didn't discover her until the next day. So she had to be in the hospital for a while, and then she went into a nursing home. And finally she died in August of 1977. Crystal, who was divorced and staying with us, helped me with the funeral. Merlin was home on vacation from Saudi Arabia at the time, but he was in Nuevo Laredo at the time. Gail and Jimmy divorced on November 16, 1977. Evan graduated from high school in 1978. He attended Graceland College for 4 years, graduating in 1982 with a degree in computer science. The girls and I were able to see him singing and dancing in a theatrical production in Des Moines in the summer of 1979, and again the next summer at Bablow Island in Michigan. Gail married Carl Iman in 1979, and Candace was born on January 8, 1982. I was able to be in Albuquerque on both occasions. I have to say, I was blessed that I was able to be with both of my daughters and my daughter-in-law Karen when they had their babies, even though I was working all the time. Evan and Karen Dickerson were married on June 12, 1982. Crystal and I were able to travel to Michigan for that. Evan and Karen survived a difficult first year of marriage as Evan developed seizures and then had brain surgery on January 11, 1983. A parasitic cyst called cysticercosis was removed, and then he was given chemotherapy to kill any other cysts. Praise the Lord, he hasn't suffered any serious after effects. Unfortunately, Gail's marriage failed due to Carl's alcoholism, or at least largely due to that, and they were divorced in 1988. An ironic twist is that Carl started going to AA after the divorce and has not had a drink since. He has now remarried. I was determined I would never marry again, but Dorman Lewis, who I had known at church for some years, succeeded in changing my mind. We were married on Mother's Day, May 12, 1985. We hurried it along a little because all my children and grandchildren were going to be home for Mother's Day anyway. We had a beautiful wedding at church with all of my family and Dorman's son Mike and daughter Jane Kroom and her family all taking part in the ceremony. Missing were Dorman's daughter Debbie Phillips and her family, who were in Germany at the time. Dorman Alden Lewis has traced his lineage on his mother's side back to John Alden, a pilgrim who came to America on the Mayflower. He is the 9th generation from John Alden. On his father's side, his lineage goes back to William Lewis, about 1685, whose descendants migrated from France to Wales, to Ireland, to Portugal, to Pennsylvania, and finally to Virginia about 1732. I have been working on that history too. These last years have been happy ones. Dorman is a chiropractor and practiced out of our large home, which we remodeled completely after we were married. We have enjoyed visits from many relatives and friends over the years. Dorman's son Mike, who had been living at home ever since he left college, continued to live with us. At different times, we also had friends living with us for various periods of time because we had a large home and enjoyed having our friends with us. We enjoyed inviting church friends home with us for Sunday dinner. Soon after we were married, we began working with the Refugee Society of San Antonio, whose chief task was settling refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Some of these refugees had very sad stories of hardship, cruelty, and loss during the Vietnamese War. Our church for 3 years sponsored a refugee family, a new one each year, providing an apartment, furnishings, transportation for grocery shopping, and to ESL classes and so on. Dorman and I kind of fell into directing a camp for children of refugee families at Camp Sionito, our church-owned camp at Bandera, Texas. We directed Camp Rainbow for 7 summers. It was often challenging and difficult, but very worthwhile. Of course, we drew on many church members to staff the camps, as well as staff from RSOS. In 1997, we decided to sell our big house. We bought a large mobile home in Leon Springs Villa on the outskirts of San Antonio. Dorman still had a few patients, so we used 1 bedroom as an office and 1 bedroom in his office for me, and still had 2 spare bedrooms, so we still had lots of room for visitors. Mike, however, went to live in an apartment in San Antonio. We've taken 3 trips together to Canada since our marriage, 2 by plane, and the last one in 2001 by car. Also, I flew up to Saskatchewan by myself for funerals in 1988 and 1995. In 2001, we drove to California, up to Washington State, then to White Rock, British Columbia, took the ferry to Vancouver Island, then back to Vancouver to the Okanagan Valley, up to Fort St. James in northern BC, then to Edmonton, Alberta, to Watrous, Saskatchewan, down to Regina, to Weyburn, and then home via Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. We traveled 7 weeks and spent only 8 nights in motels. The rest of the time we stayed in the homes of relatives. How wonderful to have so large an extended family. In Watrous, over 115 relatives attended the 50th wedding anniversary of Wilfred and Mary Schiller. We haven't counted them up, but we think we must have seen at least 175 relatives altogether. A great and unhappy shock as we traveled through Saskatchewan was the almost total lack of grain elevators. Those towering grain elevators, storehouses for grain that once dominated the prairie skyline, wonderful symbols of prairie life, have almost all of them been demolished. Our little village of McTaggart had 4 grain elevators. Now they're all gone. Farmers now haul their grain by huge trucks to the huge concrete elevators in the big cities. The little country towns are slowly disappearing. Besides the Canadian trips, we have attended World Conference on Independence every 2nd year and visited Dorman's sister June and family there, as well as his sister Donna in Lamoni, Iowa. We've also visited his daughter Debbie and family in South Carolina. The year 2000 was a bad health year. I had 2 heart attacks, the first resulting in open heart surgery, and the second in placement of 2 stents. In 2005, I had a severe bout with shingles, which laid me low, and then a great many tests resulted in a diagnosis of a benign tumor above my kidney, which was then left alone. And the year ended with cancer in my left breast and a mastectomy. Both my daughters appealed to us to move to Albuquerque so we would be closer to them, as one or both of them had made many trips to San Antonio to be with us or with me when I had my health problems. And they felt like they could look after us much better here in Albuquerque. So in March 2000, we sold our mobile home, had a big yard sale besides giving away a lot of stuff, and moved into a small but comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in Albuquerque, very conveniently near both girls. This has been a very happy time for us, despite some health problems. I had a minor stroke while in Washington, D.C. with Gail visiting her daughter Christina, who has a job with the State Department there. We have, of course, aches and pains of old age. Dorman has been diabetic for many years, but is very well controlled. He finds walking difficult because of severe arthritis and scoliosis and deteriorated discs. I'm so thankful that periodic back injections help my sciatica, but still I have some problems. Dorman enjoys his recliner and the TV. I keep pretty busy with various sewing projects, some for Crystal's pet store. Now these days I've resumed working on family history, both my family and Dorman's. We adopted 2 kittens from Crystal's pet store, now grown cats, who are a great source of joy and amusement. We enjoy our life very much and hope we will have many more good years together. We enjoy attending church at our Community of Christ congregation here and serve as we can. All my life, I've had a secure faith in God and in Jesus Christ, my Savior. I believe very strongly Jesus' statement that in serving others we serve Him. So service is, I think, a cornerstone of my faith. In the words of an old song, may the ones who come behind me find me.